Saturday, the 6th of February, 1982, Bishalach. In the Chumashim on page 271, page 271, verse, second line, verse 2. The song of Miriam, as it is called, or the song which was sung by the Israelites when they crossed the Red Sea, which was sung so beautifully this morning by Emily Bilski, former pupil of the SAJ Hebrew School, still showing strong evidence of past training. This verse, Ze Eli Bian Behu, is a verse which the classical rabbis interpret in an interesting way, which is also challenging for us today. This song is one of the oldest parts of our Bible, that is to say, following the assumption that the Bible is a human product, and is the result of a long process of evolution on the part of our ancestors. The traditional view, I presume, would be that the entire sacred text was delivered instantaneously to Moses at some point in the 13th pre-Christian century. Here we adopt the viewpoint this is an evolving text or has changed, and scholars are agreed that this is one of the oldest songs in our Torah, in our sacred texts, and the tradition has it that this song was sung at the point when the Israelites had crossed the Red Sea and the Egyptians had been drowned. Now the verse, the words that I am drawing attention to are Ze Eli Biandehu, this is my God, I will glorify him. You may remember that Herman Wouk used that sentence as the title of a book of his, which I never read. I regret. Did anybody read that book, This Is My God? Is it good? No comments, no negative comments. That? Okay. She says, from Marjorie Morningstar, one did not expect theology. The verse becomes the center of a discussion which is a crucial and central discussion in our own day. And there are a whole variety of source materials that I wish I could feel comfortable that you were acquainted with or provided the background of our discussion this morning. There are just a few items. The issue is, of course, the question of God. I hate using the word. To me, the word God begins to have as little meaning as the word therapist or reconstructionist. that is to say, it is made to carry such a wide variety of connotations that it ends up meaning nothing. When I think of the way in which the word Reconstructionist is being used in February 1982, I sometimes shudder. I mean, in terms of the distance, as I understand it, from the original way in which it was used, not that the original way should always govern the way it's used today, but that the way it's used today should have some relationship with the way it was used. As you all know, anybody can call himself a therapist, male or female, and a wide variety of sins are committed under that rubric. And the word God, likewise, is invoked by a variety of people. Perhaps the word transcendence will help us better. It is the question at the heart of religion. And if, I was going to say if this wasn't a class, which of course it is in a sense, because the duty of the rabbi for the last 2,000 years has been to teach on Saturday morning, I would have wished all of you would have watched or would be watching the current program on Channel 13 on the origin of life, which I find one of the most religiously challenging experiences I've had in many, many years. I ordered the book this week, and I hope to be speaking more about the book. When I say religious challenge, it's about evolution, of course, the origin of life, and it's done in a very delightful Bronowski rather than Sagan tradition. It raises some very serious questions. I mean, just one question that was thrown out this week. David Attenborough reminded me that flowers existed hundreds of millions of years before human beings. Ever thought of that? Flowers, in all the richness of their colors, existed millions of years before human beings. We, of course, assume that flowers exist to send to our girlfriends, and that's the reason why flowers were created. So the origin of life, whether in its book form or in its television form, I would strongly recommend. Another article this week which I found, two articles this week which I found extraordinarily destructive and challenging, which I know will be unpopular even to be mentioned from the pulpit, but I mention them anyway, is an article in the current issue of the Jewish Spectator, which will shortly find its way into the SAJ Synagogue Library, giving chapter and verse about exactly how much military equipment Israel is selling to South American fascist dictatorships. I'm talking about El Salvador, I'm talking about Chile, I'm talking about Nicaragua, and raising some of the moral issues we have been wrestling with and trying to ignore from this pulpit. There is also an article in the current issue of the New York Review of Books by Arthur Hertzberg, who needs no introduction from this pulpit because he was invited by the Reconstructionist movement to write the new introduction to Rabbi Kaplan's Judaism as a Civilization. And in fact, the new edition of Kaplan's classical text, the Judaism Civilization, which was first published in 1934, was republished in Kaplan's 100th year in honor to the centennial of this distinguished scholar, and no less a personage than Arthur Hertzberg was invited to write the introduction. It's a good introduction. We've studied it in the Hebrew High School, and I think it's published by, is it Schocken? I think it's Schocken that publishes the, is it right? Schocken. I'd hate to give the wrong publisher credit for that one. It is Schocken, isn't it? Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I'm terribly sorry. Schocken published the last paperback, the Jewish Publication Society of America. Thank you. I stand corrected. And it's an interesting essay. It's not great, but it's interesting. He writes a current issue. In the current issue of the New York Review of Books, there's an article which every Jew ought to read. I can't say any more. It's by Arthur Hertzberg, and it's called, I think the title is Why Begin Frightens Jews. And it's very important to read, in my judgment. I'm not going to go into the details here because some of the issues he raises are highly arguable, and I've suggested to Irene Hyman, the chairman of the SAJ Adult Education Committee, that some of these inflammatory and volatile topics are better handled at debates that we should be having in the synagogue over serious moral issues which concern the Jewish people and other peoples also. There were several items in the New York Times this week on moral issues relating to the Reagan administration, which I think have to be dealt with and responded to at some point in time by religious leaders. We cannot allow the Catholic Church to be the only religious institution in the world to respond to some of the serious moral issues arriving out of the current political leadership of this country. But again, cognizant of the fact that we are not a monolithic congregation, and our visitors are not monolithic, politically speaking, I think these issues should not be delivered ex cathedra from the pulpits, although I think the congregation is very much aware of my strong feelings on these issues, but should be debated. I think if we are a congregation of Jews that take these issues seriously, we should be prepared to listen dispassionately, at least manifestly, if not within, to the presentation of alternative viewpoints. The issues concerning the Reagan leadership have ceased to be political issues. They are now thoroughly moral issues which synagogues and churches and mosques cannot ignore, or if they do so, they ignore at their peril. And this is a request to the congregation at large to begin raising the issue of whether or not these issues should not be debated with carefully thought out position papers rendered by experts on the subject. And we should, as a mature group of people, be able to discuss these issues, as they say, sine ira et studio. We don't have to start screaming at each other and throwing things at each other. We should be able to discuss these things. And we also should be able to discuss these things without casting aspersions of original sin on those who disagree with our viewpoint. So I'm going to keep on persuading Irene, and I think we're going to do it. We're going to do it maybe on a Sunday so people won't feel so restrained. And that is something which I think we really ought to be going to. I mean, I don't have to tell you what's in the New York Times. I presume you all read the New York Times. Maybe you don't. I don't know. The other thing, which is more a specialist kind of book, which I suppose I can't expect you all to get hold of or read, but I feel a moral obligation to at least refer you to it. And that is a magazine which I referred to last week called Daedalus, which is kind of a recherche magazine. It's called the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's the sort of thing that academic professionals tend to read. But this issue happens to be entirely devoted to the subject of religion. Entirely devoted to the subject of religion. And at least two of the articles on which I've spent some time this week are so challenging to what we are trying to do here as Reconstructionists, and cast into profound doubt some of the axioms and assumptions on which we have been functioning as Reconstructionists. The whole issue of religious humanism, the whole issue of religious naturalism. In the same way that the whole issue of evolution is once again up for grabs, and we find that things which we took for granted 10 or 15 years ago are no longer being regarded for granted. And this very program that I referred to earlier also begins to deal with these issues. After all, here we speak of Judaism, in Rabbi Kaplan's definition, as the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. So at least two words in that definition, evolution and religion, have to be understood as concepts which simply do not stand still. The term evolution and the term religion cannot stay fixated as in terms of what it meant 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, or even 10 years ago. This enormous challenge between wrestling, first of all, with Jewish tradition, which of course is what Kaplan wrestled with, and we are all enormously indebted to the fact that he opened the road, he blazed the trail for us to raise our questions. Without his greatness and genius, we could never have raised our questions. But in a sense, we are now faced with two orthodoxies. We are faced both with the orthodoxy of Jewish tradition and the orthodoxy of Reconstructionism. And the question is, how can we best understand our current religious relationship in an age where in 50 years more change takes place than perhaps has taken place in the last 5,000 years of human culture and civilization? How we relate to the past, how we relate to the past and the present. There's a marvelous image in a program which I only half caught because I was involved in a telephone call at the time, and if anybody disturbs me on Sunday night, woe and betide them. By the way, you should watch Brideshead Revisited for no theological reason whatsoever, but just for the fun of it. Just to relax from the aggravation caused by the other contemplation. This crab, I think, this species of crustacean, that like all life begins in the sea, but is moving forward on the ladder of evolution to live in different circumstances. It too wants to be part of the evolving crustaceous civilization of the crab people, or whatever is the functional equivalent in the crab world to Reconstructionism. After all, there has to be some biological isomorphism in nature. We are, after all, part of nature. And the crab finds itself in a peculiar position. I got this second-hand from a friend of mine who watches it for me when I'm not able to watch. This crab is in a kind of a double bind. a kind of a catch-22. It wants to advance, which means leaving the water and living on dry land. But it is unable to totally sever the umbilical cord which ties it to the oceans. After all said, and how long did it take human beings before women were able to develop portable oceans? And thank God we have a plethora of portable oceans running around the SAJ this season. Having had difficulty in recruiting members from other congregations, the SAJ is engaged in a massive program of what is known in Israel as Aliyah Pnimit, internal immigration, which is also something that David Attenborough would approve of, but no doubt he would want to find various ecological reasons for. So this crab is poised between the sea from which it wants to emancipate itself and dry land on which it wants to live permanently. And it cannot do that. And so in its sexual behavior, it represents a curious conflict. It lays its eggs in the sand, but the waters of the ocean have to sweep the eggs back into the water so that there is a dependency on the past as well as a desperate need to move to the future. It suddenly occurred to me that we reconstructionists embody that crustacean experience. That on the one hand, part of us insists in the best of Kaplan tradition that unless we can find God in the here and now, and anybody who ever went to the SAJ when Kaplan was holding forth knows that that was the main thrust of what he was talking about. What God means now, over and over again. Of course, he never completely convinced us. He never completely convinced us because it's not the sort of thing one can completely convince anybody about if one is a crab living in a crabby era. That is to say, if one is in a period of evolutionary transition, which one suspects we are, then we are living in terms of two modalities. We want to find God now. We would like to think we could turn to tradition and say to tradition, you were all right, we needed you when? Before we realized that we could do beyond magic, we could do better than this particular mysticism. We didn't have to believe that nature had to have all its questions solved by some divine revelation. We believe that God should be found here and now, a la Durkheim, a la Kaplan, in the very living reality of an ongoing community. And nobody needs to tell a living and ongoing community what to do. Any group of intelligent people know what to do. They can find out what God is. They can find out what to do. They can decide what halacha is. They know how to live a proper and authentic Jewish and religious life. It sounds marvelous. Yet 3 decades of experience in the rabbinate has led me to shudder whenever I approach a group of people who are deciding by themselves how to lead the religious life. America is full of different institutions in which people, very serious people, tell you that they know how to find God in the here and now. And the more one visits those groups, and the more one participates, yes, there are some good elements, and yes, they raise some very interesting questions. But basically, deep down, there is an ephemerality about the whole thing. These are ad hoc institutions. They are as powerful as their solvency. They are theological movements a la Freddie Laker. And no matter how high they fly, the solid facts are that if you want to take over hotels and sell ideas to people, ultimately, they have to be run. They have to be public relations. And there is something so mechanical about this that one wonders whether anybody really has ever found transcendence. God, if you will, to use the word that I'm really trying to avoid using. So here we are trying to lay our eggs in the sand. But we know that unless the waters of the Torah and the Talmud and the Midrash wash over those eggs, they will never be fertilized. That somehow people are marvelous, but people can be extraordinarily illiterate and ignorant. And in our particular society, where we have opted to the greatest degree that's, I think, ever been possible in the history of the human race, to try to give everybody a chance to say what they feel, however illiterate or ignorant they may be, or however lowly or humble they may be. the dynamism is so subtly balanced these days that one often wonders what the shape of things will be in 50 or 100 years' time if some of the people who feel so violently against abortion, if some of the people who feel so violently against liberal religion, if some of the people who feel so violently that they have the right to determine what books our children should read in school, what programs we should watch on television, and who pack a very heavy clout these days through the amount of money they're raising. They are raising money. We aren't raising anything compared to what they are raising. The fundamentalist religious organizations in this country are becoming an unprecedentedly powerful political base from which the very workings of democracy might be altered, to the detriment not only of the Jew, but of every non-fundamentalist thinking person. So here we are in a kind of an in-between world. We really would like to live in the sand, but those of us who have been living in the sand know that you can just die in the sand for lack of the water that invigorates. We're not quite ready to give up the past. We're not quite ready to give up tradition. We're not quite ready to give up the Bible and the Talmud and the Midrash, nor some of the more profound psychological insights which our ancestors couch under the rubric of halakha. And so we live between two worlds, to such an extent that we look around us for experience of transcendence. I don't know whether it's something to be proud of or ashamed of. The 2 or 3 experiences of transcendence I had this week were given to me by David Attenborough, by the authors of Daedalus magazine, by Arthur Hertzberg, by, I think it was James Reston, or was it Tom Wicker? I get them confused. Just read what they write. One of the authors, it was on the 2nd of February, 1982. One of the authors was Charles Bailey, editor of the Minneapolis Tribune, and the title of his article was called Greedonomics. And the other article in the same issue of the 2nd of February was called The New States' Rights by Tom Wicker. And another negative experience of transcendence, taking the New York subway system. It suddenly occurred to me that in the spirit of what we were talking about last week, that in every era we have present all the elements of the cultural prison. And it is totally erroneous for us on our elite level of the intellectual ladder to imagine that our ways of thinking about God and transcendence are the ways in which the entire human race think about God and transcendence, or even the American people think about God and transcendence. We're really a very small puddle in this vast panorama of religion today. But that in every era we have these phenomena. In ancient Babylonia, it was called Tiamat, or the goddess of chaos, the idea of the notion of the massive abyss. I think the New York subway system would fit very well into the ancient Babylonian mythologies. As a matter of fact, it fits perfectly in. The unpredictability, the randomness, the neurotic generating procedures. Or I was reading a book this week which compared Egyptian and Mesopotamian religion. I suddenly realized that what they were saying about Mesopotamian religion fits the New York transport system perfectly. He was talking about how in Egypt the gods were benign and smiled because the rain was regular and the sun was regular and the Nile was regular. But in Mesopotamia, you never knew from one moment to the next whether the Tigris or the Euphrates were going to overflow their bounds, or whether a storm was going to descend and rip up the trees and destroy all your canals. That's the subway system. I mean, people never know. It's, in a sense, it's a blessing. We shouldn't do too much about it. Every era needs chaos in order to define what cosmos is. I think they're doing a wonderful job, except it's supposed to put the fear of God in us, and of course it doesn't quite do that. You look at the ancient mythologies, we're not so far removed from them. You see, without having the old mythological belief, we've managed to generate the experience. Ze eli v'anvehu. The rabbis make many comments on this verse and on many other verses relating to it, which deal with the question of transcendence, which leave no doubt in my mind that on some level they were just as aware, some of them were just aware as we are, of the limitations of transcendence. One rabbi says, a shifcha, a domestic, a woman that scrubs the floors, a maidservant, a menial, saw more of God at the crossing of the Red Sea than Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel did in all their glory. There's transcendence for you. Let's just read out what Rashi says on that. He's quoting from the Midrash, but he puts it very nicely. He says, Ze eli v'anvehu, Hayu marin oto be'etzba. Rashi says, basing himself on the Midrash, that at the crossing of the Red Sea, the Jews could see God physically. They actually pointed and says, Ze eli v'anvehu. That's the comment on the verse, Ze eli v'anvehu. This is my God. And at that point, the quotation is, Ra'ata shifcha al hayam, ma shelo ra'un v'im. A shifcha, a domestic, saw at the crossing of the Red Sea what the prophets themselves did not see. See, that immediately raises the question of to what extent does the group experience that one is having or the limitations of one's psychological perspective govern what one sees. Supposing any one of us could be miraculously transported back to that moment when the Israelites were crossing the Red Sea. Let's not look at the story too literally, because the poem obviously was emotion recollected in tranquility and written much later. But let's assume that in fact somebody was crossing the Red Sea and did point up and say, look, there he is. Let's assume hypothetically any one of us could be transported back to that moment. Would we see anything? Could I have some reaction to that one? I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I mean, it's a very simple question. Don't look so surprised. I'm simply saying that the rabbis say that when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, God was visible the way you are visible to me and the way I am visible to you. They could point with their finger and says, there's the old man, he done it. Now, I am suggesting that hypothetically we are transported to that situation with our present faculties, obviously, because if we're going to be in their faculties, then we are the shifcha again, and we will see what they see. Lainey?
Hard to say.
Well, if I wouldn't be asking if it was hard to say, if it was simple, I'd be saying it.
I think that what happens is that you only see what you're conditioned to see. In other words, if you go to present sensibilities, right? If I were to be there with my present sensibilities, which doesn't include the concept of being able to see God, then I wouldn't see it.
Right. Right on. Right on. Right on. Yes.
Wouldn't see when Larry Kushner in this book talks about turning down the sound on the television and then turning down the contrast all the way. But he says there's something still transmitted, but you just don't see it because you can't pick up what's being seen. So I think it would work like that you wouldn't see it. It would still be there, but you wouldn't see it.
What do we usually give what is the name we usually give to people who see things that we can't see? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. What was that? What? Yes, we have a word. We call them, we put them away. What name do we give to people who hear voices? Then the question I would like to formulate is this: if everybody hears voices, then your psychiatric definitions have to change because everybody is normal. The abnormal person then would be the person who could see clearly. Before asking Joel to talk, let me tell you how the rabbis play around with this verse. And of course, all the rabbis are not on the same level. What I'm saying is that some rabbis are extremely literalistic. And some rabbis are living in the 21st century of our era. We haven't caught up with them yet. All the prophets God spoke to, one of the rabbis says, through the translation I take from the New Testament, because the New Testament translation is very beautiful and happens to be an English translation of an original Midrashic phrase, through a glass darkly. All the prophets experienced God through a glass darkly. But Moses saw God through a glass clearly. Now you see, you'd think that that would mean that Moses saw God the way the person who was crossing the Red Sea saw God, wouldn't you? But one of the commentators says, what does that mean? The prophets saw through a glass darkly, and therefore they thought that something was behind the glass. Moses saw clearly and knew that there was nothing behind the glass. That's 21st century for you, you see. That raises a whole kind of different question. I just want to be quite clear that benightedness is not a unique, exclusive property of the 20th century, BC or AD, either way. Joel?
I think that if we saw anything, we would have used the same phrase and ended it with a question mark rather than an exclamation point.
No, I don't agree with you, and I tell you why. I agree with Laney, and I tell you why I agree with Laney. I think that if we went back to that crossing of the Red Sea, any of us here today, we would see nothing. And the reason we would see nothing would be because we were not part of the sociological Weltanschauung, the world outlook of these people, because you have to be part of that group to be able to experience it. However, we would have seen certain things which we could have defined empirically. We would have seen a lot of people, a lot of excited people, a lot of enthusiastic people, a lot of people geared to moving in what they thought was a direction of freedom, a lot of people moving in the spirit of somebody they call their master or their leader or their teacher, namely Moses. So there would have been certain, this is pure capital, there would have been certain collective activities going on, what Kaplan, following Durkheim, calls a collective effervescence. Where do we find transcendence today? I feel this is a terribly embarrassing question. But may I ask this question? And you know, nobody has to answer this question. And if there's silence, we'll know what the answer is, won't we? I've just given a few examples of what I would understand by transcendence. There are a few more intimate ones which I don't choose to share with the congregation, thank God. The week is not an entire desert. But they don't add up to Ze Eli V'Yanvehu. There is no hypostatic God hovering over the Central Park Reservoir when we jog around him, in the morning. Now, could I ask a question? Maybe we'll have some response from the congregation. I don't know who you are. I mean, visitors, certainly not. Did you lately see your transcendence? Yes.
I think you're talking about sort of an age of magic, literal, and an age of magic, figurative. Laney was talking about, it's sort of by extension, an age of magic where magic was real. We have in Shemot, Moses and Aaron going to Pharaoh, throwing staffs on the ground and becoming serpents. The type of thing that was not really written about in the later prophetical work, like the Tuvim. And so, going back to the earlier theme, when we have a sense, not of God, but of godliness today, that it is a sort of vague sensation rather than a literal ability to point, because I think people can have a sensation of the divine, of something greater than humans, and what humans can make, at certain moments, including going around the Central Park Reservoir, under certain circumstances.
Well,
but it's not a literal thing.
Well, let me get back to David Attenborough and his television program. The miracles of modern science enabled him to slow down the beating of the wings of a dragonfly. Have you seen the wings of a dragonfly slow down by 120? It's almost as interesting as going to shul, believe me. We should try the repeat program. Now, of course, one has to be extremely careful, because the fact that the symmetry is overwhelming must not delude us into into the wrong conclusions. After all, if flowers existed billions of years before man emerged, we're going to be very hard put to work out some theological position that the world and its beauty was created so that man could come and enjoy it, which is one very distinguished traditional rabbinic opinion. It does look as if there's some kind of mystery and purpose in life, but it doesn't seem to be geared to man. Perhaps that's one of the biggest shocks. One thinks back to the arguments in the 19th century between Wilberforce and Huxley as to whether there was an opposition between religion and science, because science takes the awe and the mystery out of life. My God, look how far we've traveled. If it's anything that takes the awe and mystery out of life today, it's coming to synagogue and being part of a Jewish community with all the politics involved. The mystery is looking at the wings of a dragonfly, decreased by 120%. What a paradox that is. All the backbiting and the arguments, and if somebody is not Bruegger's this week, somebody else is Bruegger's next week. Where is the transcendence in our communal life? Where can anybody point to a moment of transcendence in any communal experience? Perhaps there are moments, and maybe if there are, the question is still open. Speak up. What a terrible admission to have to say that God speaks through the slowed down wings of a dragonfly, which depend upon the science which creates a mechanism for us to be able to see, which at all the same time is a cautionary sermon to man. It was not destined for us. We are freaks in this cosmos. It was not destined. Whatever purpose is manifest in the marvels and the mysteries of nature, which David Attenborough speaks of voluminously and volubly and articulately, it will be arrogance of the worst chosen people kind, chosen humanity, man, the crown of creation, to believe that these flowers existed for billions of years so that we could come and smell them and buy them on Valentine's Day. Carol, do I see a Leviathan hand? Levitate? Yes.
This should sound like a commercial, but Pam and I were just saying that on Monday night, we had the pleasure, and I think it was almost a transcendent moment, of seeing a group of members sing the lyrics to a show that we've been working on for months and months and months, that we're going to present on March 20th.
How much are the tickets? I thought you were going to say that, Carol, and I acknowledge what you say, and I agree with you. What you're saying is that there is an element, and by the way, this again would fit in perfectly with the Kaplan paradigm, that God, or the transcendent, is experienced when one is functioning as an active, responsible member of a community. And as far as I can make out from the rehearsal sheet, responsibility, and also the acid test of those who can participate in this kind of activity is the extent to which they manifest what Kaplan calls the signal and most important divine attribute, responsibility, being able to follow through, fulfilling one's commitments. Emunah, amen, those two words mean responsible. When we say amen after bracha, what we say is whatever we believe God is, it partakes of that which is responsible, that concerning which there is follow through, that which can be depended upon, not faith in the Christian sense of the word. I experienced a moment of transcendence when Liron chanted the Ashrei antiphonally with us this morning. Not in the words of somebody whom I passed when I was walking behind the Torah, who said to me, cute. It was anything but cute. You see, that's where we don't see the transcendent. Because a child does it, you see, they thought it was cute. It wasn't cute. What it was evidence of how a young child, in the right kind of context and with the right kind of education, is able to do that in the presence of a congregation as normally as eating Wheaties for breakfast. And that is a transcendent moment which arises out of a communal context also. To call that cute is a measure of the poverty of our Jewish educational standards. That we think it's such a fantastic thing that a small child can lead the congregation in prayer. This should be something that's happening every single day of the week. When we call it cute, that's a measure of how far we have fallen off of being able to look at it. Let me move to a point that's made in the two articles in this book that have absolutely blown my mind this week are one by Mary Douglas, who is a distinguished anthropologist, who wrestles with the question, why did every scholar of religion and why did every theologian totally fail to predict the massive rise of fundamentalist religion in the latter quarter of the 20th century? None of us anticipated that this was going to happen. Orthodox Judaism has never been as triumphalist in the history of its existence. There are more Orthodox Jews around the world today than ever existed in the history of the Jewish race. Ever. There are more fundamentalist Christians in the world. It's true that on some level the Catholic Church has been losing some allegiance from some of its supporters, but the devotees of fundamentalist religions, and perhaps one should also add cults. There's a movie that my wife is trying to drag me to called Ticket to Heaven, which I understand is a rather important movie, which seems to have some kind of relationship to what we're talking about today. And let's face it, for after all said and done, this is about people looking for transcendence. The fact that the Moonies and the Hare Krishna and the Jews for Jesus have succeeded so much is because we in the synagogue offered so little. Why is Est so popular today? And why do members of Est hardly ever enter synagogues? The Jewish members, of course, I'm talking about. We didn't offer certain things in the synagogue. We were busy doing other things. And the point that Hertzberg raises in his article is whether or not the state of Israel is rapidly becoming a state so different from what it was anticipated to become by its founders, it will lose all touch whatsoever with the rest of the Jewish people and go its own way in the Middle East. This is a moral challenge. That when the spiritual concerns of a country are put so low, the issue is, in what level is it still Jewish? In what sense can we use the word? There's another word that is beginning to lose meaning in the 20th century. Reconstructionist, God, therapist, and Zionist. The issue of where we can find God is precisely what drives these young people to look. C.G. Jung, some years ago, wrote an interesting article on flying saucers. Now, you know, there are a lot of people said they saw flying saucers. I never saw a flying saucer. A lot of highly intelligent people wrote letters to papers saying they saw flying saucers. Jung was of the opinion that people did see something, that it was part of a desperate hunger and thirst on the part of modern man for the transcendent, that when there is nothing there that can be experienced because of the kind of thing that Carol spoke about. How long does it take to get a group of people together committed to that kind of project, Carol? I'll tell you, it takes about 20 years, or even longer. As a matter of fact, the SAJ did it once before, and we have members here, I think, who saw that program, a program called Punch and Judaism. Did anybody here see Punch and... I'm sorry, what is the laughter here? Excuse me, Sydney, did you see Punch and Judaism? Hadassah, did you see Punch and Judaism? Were you in Punch and Judaism? Would you say, you don't have to answer Hadassah, you can plead the fifth, but would you say that, listening to Carol, that something of the same kind of excitement? I never saw it, but when I heard Irving Driesen talking about it, as a matter of fact, I think this is Punch and Judaism, this is son of Punch of Judaism. That's what March the 20th is.
What is Punch and Judaism?
Punch and Judaism is a kind of a skit that the SAJ put on in 1920 what? I'm sorry, Hadassah, I don't want to date the whole thing, but it was a long time ago. The very beginning, Rabbi Kaplan had just left the Jewish Center, 1930. So it was about 8 years after the inception of the synagogue. What a shame we didn't have it videotaped or any. I hope that we're going to preserve, at least for history, some of the stuff here. So in 60 years' time, when they're all criticizing us, at least there'll be some evidence of what was done. That's the kind of thing that can come from participation in the group. But what's happened today is the group has disintegrated. People can't find the kind of group that can turn them on. And so they look for flying saucers, and they look for groups that will treat them on an atomistic level, on an individual level. A lot of people avoid the kind of closeness. A lot of people avoid the kind of closeness that the SAJ offers. It's threatening to people. A lot of people I know in New York City deliberately choose programs and activities in which they will not have to encounter other human beings. They may be physically in the same room with other human beings, but they don't want to encounter other human beings. For my sins I teach at the new school. One of the biggest shocks I had when I began to teach at the new school 10 years ago was that the new school is not a synagogue. I wanted to know every student by their first name. I wanted every student to introduce himself or herself to every other student. That was the biggest gaffe you could think of. People went to the new school to avoid other people. They didn't want to meet other people. People sit in a class for 15 weeks, multiplied by an hour and a half, and they leave without knowing the name of the person who's been sitting next to them, and feeling very proud that the teacher has never referred to them by name. They don't want it. This is part of the pathology of the 20th century, which is why it's so... People don't believe that the SHA can exist and provide this kind of transcendent meaning. That's why if somebody says, I'd like to take you to synagogue, the answer invariably is, you've got to be kidding. We have enormous difficulty. Could you confirm that for me, please? No, nobody believes me. Would you please stare at Carol and... no, you just don't... You confirm it. And people think it's an insanity that people can even begin to think of discovering. And incidentally, it's highly appropriate in a Reconstructionist synagogue that an intense transcendence should be experienced in preparing for a play. Because one of the things that Reconstructionism insists on is that, as Rabbi Kaplan put it, unless people have other things in common, they can't have religion in common. Unless there are things that people want to do together over and above coming to synagogue, studying, discussing, arguing, debating, eating, dining, fooling around with each other, they're not going to have that experience in the synagogue. And incidentally, it's okay. It's okay for people not to want to get close to other people. It's okay. I happen to think that, you can have the best of both worlds. Everybody needs space, but you also need a little proximity. But some people don't want any proximity. They want a lot of space. Now, the article that really is perturbing me this week is an article by Louis Dupré. It perturbs me because I can't go along with it completely because of the crab. What he's saying basically is that in the 20th century, it's not that Judaism and Christianity and Islam and the classical religions are going to die, not to mention how long the other SLN and Est and all the other cults, etc., will continue, how long they'll continue. The fact is, he says, that the people who go to these religious institutions, I think he must be excluding the Orthodox, the extremely Orthodox, go not because the religious institution validates in itself, as it were, sui generis, something that they are looking for, but that it confirms what they've already found. In other words, that you don't go to a synagogue because it's going to give you the truth. You're going to go to a synagogue because the truth that you've discovered yourself is going to be welcomed there. Does anybody understand this point? It's a terribly important point, and it really shook me. In other words, let me read a quotation from it. It's a very, very interesting, and in a sense, this chapter criticizes many of the things that I've been saying. You know how strong I've been on the importance of us knowing tradition, the importance of every member of the SAJ being able to do what Liron did this morning. Stand up in front of the congregation and daven. Chant a few verses from the Torah or the Haftarah. By the way, this is an open invitation to any member of the congregation. The cantor will be delighted to have you up here, but you've got to be able to do it properly. You've got to work at it. We don't want to canonize illiteracy here. We don't want people to be cute. We want people to be authentic. It's a whole different thing there. The search for a deeper spiritual life, he writes, is more than a passing phenomenon on today's religious scene. It is a moment for religious survival. For without the support of a sustaining personal decision, a religion that remains unassisted by the surrounding culture and is constantly under attack in the believer's own heart is doomed to die. Let me start a little earlier then. The religious attitude, he says, has become what it never was before, a matter of existential choice. The choice is usually not made on the basis of a relatively clear experience, but of an accumulation of experiences inviting reflection and confronting man with possibilities, one of which, his decision, his choice, must convert into existential certainty. Thence the joining of a religious community, the reception of sacraments, even the acceptance of an established doctrine means something essentially different from what they meant for our ancestors. For symbolic gestures and doctrinal representations, accepted by deliberate decision rather than conveyed by direct experience, turn into empty shells unless they are constantly replenished by an intensive and deliberate spiritual awareness. See, what he's saying is that today the individual has got to find transcendence in his own or her own universe. Certain experiences, whether on Channel 13 or elsewhere, or one's personal life, between man and woman, between man and man, between parent and child, will make one feel that certain experiences need to have a wider matrix in which to express themselves for them to be fully articulated. It's like seeing a painting on the wall of a room that's too small to really enable people to experience the painting in perspective. So when we are raising a family, for example, I'm just giving one example, one has certain experiences. They're not all good experiences. Bad experiences can also be transcendental or point in the realm of the transcendent, that we know need a larger canvas, a larger context. In other words, the very experience of non-transcendence cries out for a transcendental context in which to experience. It's almost as if the nothingness that Moses saw behind the glass in itself at its borders and perimeter speaks of a transcendence, that the negation points to the affirmation, or presupposes the affirmation, or indicates the affirmation. Now what this man is saying is that religion today, outside of the fundamentalist organizations, is going to have to be an existentialist choice on the part of the individual. He's talking about you. He's saying that everybody who comes to the SAJ at some point made an existential choice that what he or she had discovered in his or her own mature adult life about all the things I've just been talking about could best be validated by being here on Saturday morning than by being somewhere else, or if not necessarily here every Saturday morning, participating in what we are doing. And this is the opposite of what used to be the case. In the past, the individual's religious meaning and experience derived as an overflow from the symbols and sancta of the group. What has happened today, Louis Dupre is saying, is the other way around. The symbols and the sancta of the group will have meaning insofar as enough individuals will be able to find that these particular group of sancta, and not another group of sancta, can validate the experiences that we're having. It is a mistake, however, this is the criticism of me. It is a mistake, however, and one frequently made by those who undertake the spiritual journey, to believe that the solutions to all our problems lie buried in old masters and ancient monasteries. The doctrines, lifestyles, and methods of a previous age were conceived within the reach of a direct experience of the sacred. This has, for the most part, ceased to exist. The language of past mystics of the 18th as well as the 14th century, unlike that of the classics of philosophy and literature, strike us today as antiquated because the experience therein articulated is no longer even minimally present. A confrontation with the past may be necessary, but the shape of spiritual life in the future will be entirely our own. It's the word entirely that worries me a little, because I go back to the image of the crab. Yes, maybe in the future, but not right now. Maybe in the future, in the next stage of religious evolution, a community of Jews will be able to walk out of the water and live on dry land without having to go back to the ocean. But you know what? The very statement itself contradicts itself as soon as it's said.
That's because there's going to be a community of them. The problem of the reason that there isn't an experience of the divine, the transcendent, is because we don't live in a group. So we take vacations in the group. In other words, you go to synagogue, you go to have a vacation of going back to that experience of being in the group. Now, at some point, to me, the experience of the transcendence that I have the most often is working on something, and then all of a sudden it clicks and you realize it's going to work. Whatever it is, whether you're studying something individually, you're working through, all of a sudden you realize it's going to work. It's before it even works, but you suddenly realize that it's going to happen. And you suddenly have that experience. Now, if enough of those crabs all at the same time took off, that would be a different story. But that's a later.
Yes, all right. But I was going one stage further in that you can't have that kind of life unless you create the equivalent of the ocean on Earth. And in fact, what the program showed was that the stage where the crabs began to be able to survive on dry land was when the eggs were able to distill by some unknown way a drop of water in which they were able. So in other words, you're not really leaving the water. You're creating other ways of bringing the water with you. Now, we have to stop at this point. I just want to make one comment about the crossing of the Red Sea. I don't believe that everybody at the crossing of the Red Sea pointed the finger and said, "This is my God." I believe that some people saw God the way some people today hear voices, and that seeing hallucinations and hearing voices was more acceptable in that kind of society than it is today. And maybe the number of people who saw visions and heard voices was a larger number than is the ratio in modern society. But I stand convinced that in that society also that crossed the Red Sea, there were Reconstructionists. There were people who understood that what was going on was the emancipation of a group of people from slavery to freedom, and that in that emancipation lay the promise of transcendence and not in any external form or symbol. And that it was the later generations who picked on the experience of the few rather than of the many, because in writing myth has to be for everybody. And therefore the lowest common denominator of myth is often the legend, is often the rather crude symbol, is the image, is the icon, is the dogma. The dogma is there for the guidance of the weak and for the insight of the intelligent and the smart. And I don't think there's ever been an era when this was different. Even when we were in the cave, I'm convinced that some people took those drawings on the wall as genuine magic, and some people benignly participated and said, it has social cohesion, it's good. Some people need to believe that if we don't do that, it won't work. Yes, sir.
You understand it correctly, Rabbi. In order to understand the future, you must first understand the past.
You couldn't have ended my sermon with a more profound observation. Let me just repeat it. In order to understand the future, we have to understand the past, which Rabbi Kaplan put in a different way. The past has a vote, not a veto. But as Rabbi Bronner, the dean of the College in Philadelphia, says, the trouble with many of us Reconstructionists today, we're so interested in the veto that we haven't bothered to learn too much about the vote. And what you were saying was that without understanding the significance of the vote, in other words, to reject something from the past, for a group of people, for example, to get together, make halakhic decisions without knowing what they're talking about is a travesty of what evolution means in Jewish religion. Before you can veto, you have to know the meaning of the vote. We rise for Aleinu on page 192.